This is the beginning of a new sermon series, a series that I've been kind of looking at doing for several weeks now. We just came out of a sermon series that went through Advent and on through Christmas, and then we took a little break, one Sunday break, and now we're into this one. It's a sermon series on the leading causes of life. The leading causes of life. Today, I just kind of want to do a little bit of an introduction. I just want to kind of talk about where we're going and why it is that we're going to be looking at this. First off, as we heard in Deuteronomy 30, which I don't know why I keep wanting to call it 29, we heard in Deuteronomy that God wants us to choose life. That God has set choices before us. We have choices that we can make. He's given us free will, the ability to choose things. And He set things before us that will give us life, that will allow us to prosper and to grow and to be who it is that God intended us to be. But there are choices that we make. God wants us to choose life. But I've found that instead of choosing life, instead of seeking to make choices that nurture and develop life, we tend to, and this isn't true for everybody, I know it's a broad stereotypical statement, we tend to, but we tend to fight death instead of choose life. We tend to push away the things that will harm us instead of nurturing the things that cause us to grow. Anti-death is not necessarily the same as nurturing life. And we spend our time in the language of death and how we fight it, how we rail against it, how we push it away from us. We tend to fall into that kind of language instead of the language of life, the language that brings us life. It's in the news everywhere. It's what we hear. It's what we talk about. It's what's on the talk shows. It's those kinds of things. I mean, certainly if it was never any more talked about than it has been recently, it's being talked about now because of the earthquake that we just experienced in Haiti. And so our minds are thinking in terms of death and of the perishing and of the aid that needs to be brought to bear in those places. We're well versed in the language of death, despair, and fear. We even hear it couched in the language of our government. You can hear the negativity in this as we talk about the war on poverty. Now, not that we shouldn't be fighting poverty, not that we shouldn't be bringing things into impoverished areas that bring life, but it's always about the negative, the war on drugs, the war on AIDS, the war on terror. We're well versed in hearing about the things that tear us down. And perhaps we talk so much about death because we really don't have the language skills developed necessary to speak about life. However, if we know what to look for, if we know how to speak about it, if we know where to look, we can find the leading causes of life, and we can find them in the most surprising places. I'm going to talk about something that I'll get back to it later, but there's a tent city in Camden. You can see it from the river line as you take the train in toward Camden, as you head into the city. It appears to speak of death and despair to those who don't know much about it. But I would like to say to you that if we learn the language of life, it can even be found there. I'm going to talk about that later on, but it can even be found there. And finding it, finding the things that lead to life, the leading causes of life, they then can be nurtured so that life can flourish. This sermon series on the leading causes of life is intended to begin to give us the language we need and the glasses, if you will, the lenses we need to look for the leading causes of life, so that we can talk about life, and then hopefully immersed in the language of life, we can begin to do more than just spend our days fighting against and fearing death and the things that bring death, but we will instead choose life Choose to nurture the things that bring life. Choose to water the things that bring life. If we're going to choose life as God implores us to do in today's text in Deuteronomy, we need to know how to identify it and to speak about it. This sermon is based on a book that I read. I guess you can see it on the screen here. That's the cover of the book in a kind of a tile format. It's called The Leading Causes of Life. And it's designed to be a practical sermon, a sermon to give you some tools, if you will, a sermon to be implemented. In the book, the author talks about the book being somewhat like a field guide. He says that all of us can walk into the woods, and those of us who choose to do that, enjoy that, can enjoy the beauty of the woods as we experience nature. But he says you really can't enjoy it to its fullest and really know what it is you're seeing unless you've read about it and learned about it. Unless you have a guidebook that you can look and say, oh, that's such and such a tree, it grows this way, it produces this kind of flower and fruit and vegetation, or that's such and such an animal. Or so as you look at the flora and fauna, until you know about it, you really can't understand it and really appreciate it. And so what he's saying in this book, that this book is kind of like our field guide, and I hope these sermons become practical as well and kind of like our field guide. And we learn, again, to identify these things. Almost every Sunday, we have a time of praise and testimony. And those of you who have been coming out for quite a while, you've heard me explain once in a great while why we do that. Why it is that I want to have a time of praise and testimony. When I take the time to explain it, I tell you it's because I want you to be intentionally looking for the living God in your daily life. You know, each week I'm going to ask you, where did you see God? And I'm expecting people to raise their hand or stand up where they are and to tell us where they've seen God. And unless you're intentionally looking for God in your lives, it's going to be hard to tell those stories, to have that language. I also tell you that I want you to do that because I want you to become more and more comfortable speaking that language, talking about God. If we can talk and hear about God, then it won't be long that we can then talk about God out in community. When people ask us how our life is, what's going on, what we've seen, where we are, they want to hear stories from us, we will have been thinking about God and we will have the ability to talk about God. That's, again, the reason behind this sermon. To choose life, we have to know what it is we are seeing. We have to intentionally look for these things, to have a shared language to talk about what it is that we are seeing. Life has a language that allows us to talk to each other deeply and meaningfully and practically across many boundaries that would otherwise separate us. When we gather that common language, some of the things about death that separate us as human beings, that classify us, that set us aside and apart from each other, will be gone because we'll have that common language and we can speak together. We in the church know the power of language. And the key really is to focus the conversation on life and not death. We know the power of words. We know the power of language. We see at the very beginning of our scriptures the first words that speak to us from the Bible. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the Spirit of God swept over the face of the waters. Then God spoke. Then God spoke.